The Apollo Moon Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight, Part 2 by Randy Walsh.
Chapter 1. Jack Parsons, His World of Rockets, the Occult, and His Influence on NASA. I found some very interesting information on Jack Parsons, who was purported to have been a brilliant rocket scientist. I wrote this video according to the two sources I cite in this video, giving them the benefit of the doubt that their information is correct, since it's difficult to verify a lot of it. However, while you're watching this video, you'll see more than a few hints that the full story about Parsons may not as of yet been written. Therefore, I will leave it up to the viewers to decide for themselves as to whether they see the need to go beyond the official narrative of this rather interesting and colorful character. However, the official narrative for Jack Parsons makes for some very interesting reading and viewing on its own, given his influence on rocket science. Further, this video does not go into details on the occult and Masonic aspect of NASA, which has been written about by numerous authors. However, it does mention Parsons' connection to the strange world of the occult, which may in part explain why this man's name is nowhere near the forefront of the aerospace industry, given that his theories contributed to the success of unmanned as well as manned space missions, including that of the Space Shuttle program. Welcome to the world of Jack Parsons. There were two sides to Jack Parsons, his world of rockets by day and his world of the occult by night. In addition, these very same people will be surprised to learn that Parsons' passion for rocketry particularly paved the way to rocket technology that is still in use today. This is all the more amazing given that Parsons' formal education was no more than a high school diploma. His theories were incorporated into the overall design of rocket technology in general, which included the Apollo moon missions, all of which went no further than low Earth orbit, if even that, as has been established in Part 1 of this series, and the Space Shuttle, which was retired in 2011. And in his spare time, Parsons, with an equal amount of passion, studied the world of the occult and the works of the well-known Satanist Aleister Crowley, with whom he maintained a close correspondence. His world of the occult eventually became his driving force, which is apparent later on in his career, with many coincidences along the way that seem beyond belief. NASA tends to be hesitant on its recognition of Jack Parsons, presumably due to his unorthodox background and the fact that he wasn't the usual academic or trained scientist. But there is some information about Parsons on NASA's website, though very little, given his contribution to the aerospace industry. Parsons had the look of a man who could easily have been mistaken for a Hollywood actor rather than the usual look of the studious scientist deep in thought in a classroom or lecture hall writing down equations on a blackboard. Further, it's not often that a man who not only lacked the recognized academic credentials but also a passionate pursuer of the occult would have the influence that he did on the whole era of rocket propulsion systems. This included the fact that he not only co-founded the Aerojet Corporation, later named the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but also had a lunar crater named after him. However, as will be discussed, Jack Parsons' world by day would eventually come in contact with his world by night. He would slowly move away from the industry that he had so passionately devoted most of his career to and immerse himself into the world of the occult with equal passion. Ironically, he would eventually find himself working in the film industry, not as an actor, but in the area of special effects. But as you will learn, both of his worlds would eventually collide, bringing an instant and early end to the world of Jack Parsons. This is a man who is just now being revered for his contribution to an industry dominated by the appearance of the stereotypical-looking, suited, dark-rimmed glasses academics. Jack Parsons was born in Los Angeles on October 2, 1914. Soon afterwards, in 1915, Jack's parents, Marvel and Ruth Parsons, divorced. He saw little of his father in the years to come. This would haunt Jack for the rest of his life, compounded by the fact that he always strived to find that father figure he so longed for. It has often been said that brilliant and genius go hand in hand with emotional turmoil, leading to a complicated, insecure, sometimes insensitive and eccentric human being, which aptly describes the brilliant Jack Parsons. After Jack's parents divorced, his mother Ruth had agreed with her wealthy parents, Walter and Carrie Whiteside, that they should live together for the sake of the young Jack. The Whitesides moved to Los Angeles and purchased a home in the posh town of Pasadena. Jack was fortunate enough to grow up in a wealthy environment with servants, which gave him plenty of time for his wild and young imagination to flourish. It wasn't long before he came across Jules Verne and his classic book, From the Earth to the Moon. This is a story about a group of American soldiers who designated a plan to send themselves into low Earth orbit and beyond on a journey to orbit the moon. Then, the young Jack Parsons eventually found the popular magazine series Amazing Stories, which was the first magazine that concentrated solely on space-age fiction. Here we see more than a hint of how this young Jack Parsons' passion for rocket technology stood out from most children his age. There was a little inspiration in the 1920s and 30s for a child fascinated by rockets to pursue this as a career. In fact, rockets were comic book lore, and although they were written about in some non-fiction articles, they were not considered part of the scientific literature and therefore were not to be taken seriously. Further, that meant that there were no courses on rocket science in the education system available at that time, so there was no guidance for anyone wanting to pursue a path to now what is known as the aerospace industry. But that didn't deter Parsons with his passion for rockets, as he was already dreaming of interplanetary travel when most children his age were off chasing each other in hide-and-seek games and or acting out their favorite movie idols. Individuals like Jack stand out from the rest of us, although to be fair, without the rest of us, there would not be a society for these exceptional people to flourish. More often than not, men and women like Parsons usually defy conventional thinking and walk a path of greatness that then leads people to ponder their greatness for centuries to come. We've seen many examples of this in history in areas such as mathematics, physics, philosophy, medicine, both conventional and alternative, and music, including classical jazz right up to the contemporary genres. You occasionally see it in politics, although not so much these days, as the message to anyone who dares to have a mind of their own is usually offered a fact-based report other than the fictional Warren Commission report for their reading entertainment. To add to Parsons' mystic, he was not exactly a stellar student. In fact, he was considered to have been below average by the educational system that, more often than not, missed the real intelligence and potential in students such as Parsons. The educational system tends to judge intelligence on how well students memorize and regurgitate their answers on paper. It makes one wonder how many seemingly and wrongfully labeled unintelligent students have been deprived of their rightful place in history and how society has been cheated out of their brilliance and genius. And to further compound the mystic about Parsons, he was considered to have a learning disorder. It is now called dyslexia, a disorder that causes the individual to read words and sentences in different orders or to misspell them. Author George Pendle writes, "Throughout his life he would misspell words, and his handwriting in particular, the words usually printed in capitals rather than written in cursive, indicates a learning disorder. At the time, dyslexia was not considered a legitimate complaint, and children who suffered from it were generally considered to be backward or stupid. For anyone, let alone an avid reader as Parsons, the variable grades that resulted from his learning disorder would have only fueled a dislike for establishment education. Thankfully, society is now recognizing that dyslexia is no determination of intelligence. In fact, in some cases, people with dyslexia have above average intelligence and creativity, as was apparent with Jack Parsons. How ironic then that Jack, who was constantly being harassed and bullied in school, would be rescued on one such occasion by a fellow student who himself had dyslexia, Edward Foreman. The two students would soon become lifelong friends and future collaborators in the pursuit of rocket science, producing work that would reverberate for decades to come. If the idea of two people with dyslexia accidentally meeting and then going on to make a major contribution to the aerospace industry seems coincidental, it gets even better. Jack Parsons' World by Day. A well-known rocket scientist by the name of Robert Goddard had started writing his theories down long before Jack Parsons arrived on the scene, notwithstanding the Russians. It would take another book to discuss Goddard's contribution to the world of rocketry, but where Goddard retreated into obscurity after being constantly ridiculed by the media for his theories on rocket science, Parsons was the opposite, who was much more confident, not caring all about what people or the media had to say about it. Parsons enrolled at Pasadena Junior College, but because of the Great Depression in the 1930s, their family's fortune dwindled and he was forced to drop out after one term and find work. However, 18-year-old Parsons turned his unfortunate situation into an asset when he found work at the Hercules Power Company in Los Angeles, which was known as the largest TNT production company for the United States during World War I. It was here that Parsons began to hone his skills in mixing of propellants that would incorporate into his theories on rocket propulsion systems in the future. It was here, too, that he became an expert on chemicals and explosives, two very important aspects of rocket technology. Parsons' friend Ed Foreman also worked at the Hercules Powder Company as an apprentice, and they eventually collaborated on developing rocket technology to the point where their trial and error approach to solving problems now required the type of mathematical calculations that they both lacked. Even though Parsons was by no means devoid of mathematical abilities, as his papers with numerous algebraic equations show, he lacked the necessary skills of differential calculus necessary for the complex calculations needed in rocket technology. Caltech needs no introduction, and a quick Google search will show the many famous scientists who were either students and/or employees there. What's even more amazing is Caltech's acceptance of two seemingly uneducated individuals, Parsons and Foreman, when they casually walked into the preeminent university in 1935 looking for the author of an article on rocket technology published in the Los Angeles Times. It's another example of Parsons' confidence and refusal to intimidate by the appearance of what many would consider academic men beyond reproach. The author's name of this article was William Bolle. A graduate of aeronautics, the study of motion in air, had presented a paper at Caltech on the recent work of a member of the Austrian Society for Rocket Technology, Eugene Sanger. Sanger, who had conducted most of his work apart from the scientific establishment and without any outside funding, spoke in strong optimistic terms about the possibility of rockets being used to power aircraft. What the newspapers were most excited about was the mention of maximum velocities and breaching of the stratosphere. Parsons and Foreman walked right into Bolle's office and introduced themselves, expressing interest in his work. But what Parsons and Foreman really saw in this article was the potential for rockets to be used other than in aircraft. For them, they saw an obvious means of leaving Earth's atmosphere for LEO. It's an example of how Parsons envisioned a future for rockets as compared to his academic contemporaries who lacked the insight of a man like Parsons, going as far as to mock those who even suggested the use of rockets in any other capacity besides aircraft. However, some of that mocking behavior of his peers would turn out to be justified given the present state of NASA's non-existent manned-launched capabilities to LEO, which is no fault of the brilliant Parsons. Bolle was busy with his own research unrelated to rockets, but was impressed enough upon meeting Parsons and Foreman for the first time to recommend them to a graduate student named Frank Molina. It was this introduction that formed the team of Parsons, Foreman, and Molina. Frank Molina had studied mechanical engineering and had an interest in interplanetary spaceflight. However, at the time he met Parsons and Foreman at Caltech, he was working at the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology, GALCIT, specifically in the wind tunnel experimenting with scale model designs of aircraft submitted by several aviation companies. but he was so impressed with Parsons and Foreman's work that he immediately saw the possibilities, which rekindled his own passion for rockets. Since the 1930s was a time where rockets were not a part of any academic curriculum, this meant, of course, that there were no scientists trained in any aspect of rocketry, or better put, there were no rocket scientists as of yet. Rockets were only taken serious when seen on a big screen alongside Buck Rogers. This is all the more remarkable when considering the future achievement of Parsons, who had little or more than a high school education, whose work would be credited with solving problems which eventually contributed to the success of the space shuttle program. But at the time, Frank Malina clearly saw Parsons' potential regarding his lack of academic credentials. Pendle quotes Frank Malina saying, "It seems to me that at most he had finished high school. When I met him, he already had a certain amount of experience with the manufacture of explosives, but I think what was outstanding about him was that he was not of any fixed view on which way to go. He had a very flexible sort of attitude." Soon, Parsons and Foreman would be working alongside the university-educated Malina at Gelsit, and in the process, the team acquired its skill for differential calculus. And this flexible sort of attitude would soon lead Parsons and his newfound team, aptly called the Suicide Squad, due to their experiments and the occasional explosions that would reverberate through Caltech, on a path that would bring innovative technologies for the future of the aerospace industry. These technologies were then incorporated by an industry that would benefit most from Parsons' brilliance, even more so than the manned space program, that of the military-industrial complex. Parsons, Foreman, and Malina would go on to influence the aerospace industry for decades to come. This caused him to remember a method first used 1,500 years ago, but was formally used in 648 to 685 AD by the Byzantine Empire and their use of liquid flaming weapons. Theories of its ingredients included asphalt. Parsons' idea in solving the problem of using black powder was not to use it at all. He made up for his lack of theoretical and mathematical schooling with his prodigious memory, broad experimental knowledge, and most importantly, his ability not to be dissuaded by conventional thought. Black powder would never be suitable for rocket fuel, but the armed forces wanted a solid-fueled JATO. When is a solid fuel not a fuel? It was a question that Parsons answered with the Archimedean Eureka! As Malina affirmed, it seemed that suddenly, as if by addition of some ingenious ingredient, all of the various stuff that was in the back of Jack's mind gelled. Parsons replaced black powder with asphalt after hundreds of years of established method, making them stable and reliable. In essence, Parsons rewrote the book on solid-fuel rockets and is a method that is still in use today. Once again, Jack Parsons refused to allow himself to be restricted by any preconceived notions, including an education system that more often than not promotes a consensus, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, there are occasions when the consensus has been proven wrong by individuals who have had the insight and have refused to allow themselves to be governed by a set of rules. Thanks to Parsons' work, solid-fuel boosters were used to successfully launch the space shuttle for 30 years. Parsons and his team now concentrated on the area of liquid-fueled rockets and were faced with similar instability problems experienced with solid-fuel rockets. They needed to find a stable liquid fuel. There were pros and cons to using both solid fuel and liquid fuel rockets. When solid fuel rockets are ignited, they cannot be shut down, so they burn until their fuel runs out. But liquid fuel rockets were considered more practical since, unlike solid fuel rockets, they can be shut down at any time. Parsons' work had proved essential in the design and engineering of future weapon systems and rocket technology in general. Most notably, his inventions included the solid fuel boosters used to help launch the space shuttle into LEO. These accomplishments to the aerospace industry are still more amazing when you consider Parsons' passion for the darker and more sinister world. This will be discussed next. Jack Parsons' World by Night. For many people, the attraction to the occult by a rocket scientist is contrary to the logical and studious academic whose only interest should be reading, researching, and doing scientific experiments. It is a community of trained scientists who represent themselves as society's sober second thought, logic being their only trait, or at least, that is how they like to be portrayed. Yet, how disturbing it is for many people, especially among scientists from all backgrounds, to find out that one of the most innovative and revered rocket scientists of the 20th century, whose theories have been instrumental in space shuttle programs and military ballistic missiles, would also be a devout occultist going so as far as to practice the very satanic rituals most people would be horrified by. But that is exactly who Jack Parsons was, filled with much of a passion for the occult as he was for the work in the field of rocket science. But to gain some understanding of Parsons' attraction to the occult, it is necessary to at least briefly discuss one of the occult's revered and infamous leaders, Aleister Crowley, to whom Parsons corresponded with on a regular basis. For many people, Aleister Crowley was a man who needed no introduction. He was revered, despised, and/or feared, depending on your opinion of him. He was also one of the world's most infamous Satanists, whose admirers and followers included celebrities, top rock musicians including the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, the power elite of British society, and of course one of the innovative rocket scientists, Jack Parsons. It is intriguing to see the world from Parsons' perspective while appreciating his enormous contribution to the world of rocket science and the influence he had with the aerospace industry. He is an example of how scientists and aerospace engineers are subject to the same kind of influence as everyone else, whether it is religion, culture, books, movies, the occult. The list is long, including an admiration for Aleister Crowley, aka the Great Beast. As peculiar as it may seem, the influence Aleister Crowley had on Parsons may have influenced his push for more powerful rocket systems. It also is not surprising that Parsons wasn't all that concerned about the fact that his work was being used in propulsion methods on weapon systems, which are now standard in the military-industrial complex. In part, the military-industrial complex is the area where Parsons' true legacy lies. That is not to say that Parsons deliberately set out to harm humanity, and in fact, he may have thought he was doing a noble service, or one can assume. But nonetheless, most would agree that his desire to follow a man who called himself Baphomet, Frater Perdurabo, the Master Therian, 666, and the Great Beast definitely had some influence on his work. Pendle writes, a novelist, poet, philosopher, mountaineer, chess master, painter, big game hunter, but above all, magician. Crowley was born in England in 1875 into a wealthy but austere religious family. As a child, he was allowed to read only the Bible. It did not convince him. He grew up to rail ferocity against both the British prudery and the strictures of orthodox religion, proudly positioning himself in direct opposition to God and the established Christian Church. To this end, he identified himself with the Great Beast from the Book of Revelation. After Crowley had joined several occult societies, he found a way to separate himself from the hierarchy found in any religious and satanic order when his wife, Rose Kelly, who was in a hashish-induced trance at the time, ordered him to go to a temple he had constructed in his apartment while they were visiting Cairo, Egypt in 1904. Here he heard a man's voice which dictated to him, which then became a book, the Book of the Law. This book became the central text of Thelema, a spiritual philosophy followed by all members of the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO. It is this book that is the basis of an occult ritual that Parsons saw for the first time and would influence him for the rest of his life, a book that would create two worlds for Jack Parsons that would inevitably lead these two worlds to collide. As for Rose Kelly's hashish-induced trance at the time, drugs would play a prominent role with Crowley, and it is said that Parsons too, which eventually led to Crowley having a serious addiction to both drugs and alcohol in later life. However, there appears to be no evidence of Parsons using drugs when involved in the serious issue of rocket science, which indicates that he limited his use of any drugs to occult rituals. Ordo Templi Orientis. Parsons was soon to be introduced to Wilbert Talbot Smith by another scientist whose identity is unknown. But it would seem that Parsons was not the only scientist at Caltech with some connection to Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO. Smith was Crowley's representative in Los Angeles who introduced Parsons to Crowley's mystical order, the OTO. This was the only OTO order in Los Angeles, and in another of many coincidences, it was located only a few miles from Parsons' own house. There are many aspects to satanic rituals which people find disturbing, which were now a routine part of Parsons' life. This is what John Carter has to say. This enigmatic fusion of sex and rockets was to prove a fascinating development in the history of the aerospace industry in America. In yet another interesting coincidence, Parsons happened to meet L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the Church of Scientology, which needs no introduction considering its connection to Hollywood and the numerous stories that are so often sensationalized in the media. And as it is typical of Parsons' apparent vulnerability, Hubbard too had a major influence on him. And in one of many letters Parsons had written to Crowley, whom he had referred to as Most Beloved Father, he explained his friendship with Hubbard, saying that he is the most thelemic person he had ever met. Within the modern system of thelema, developed by occultist Aleister Crowley in the first half of the 20th century, thelemic mysticism is a complex mystical path designed to do two interrelated things: to learn one's unique true will and to achieve union with the All. Jack Parsons' worlds collide. In 1944, both Parsons and Foreman were forced to sell their stock in JPL. This eventually led Parsons being ostracized by the scientific community, even though the rocket industry was now being taken seriously and more so by the military-industrial complex. In their world, there was just no room for the unorthodox style of a scientist who lacked the formal education of an academic, despite the fact that Parsons' innovation and insightfulness brought solutions which are still in use today. At the age of 30, Parsons was cut adrift from the world of rocketry for the first time in his adult life. It was plain to see that, like Goddard before him, he was left behind as the very science he had helped to create soared up and away from him. This led Parsons' deeper involvement into the occult and his increased use of black magic. This greatly disturbed Crowley, who saw black magic as nonsensical. Instead, Crowley preferred his own form of magic to be used for mental and mystical development. Parsons, however, saw it differently, who preferred the version put forward by the media, that of evil rather than good. This shows another aspect to Parsons, where he seems to have chosen a deliberate path to evil, which could be interpreted by many as a disdain for humanity. However, given the complexity of a man like Parsons, one can never be too sure as to what the path he chose meant for him. The path that Parsons was on would lead those closest to him to worry as to what his real motivations were, and how far he was prepared to go in many of the rituals in which he immersed himself. His trusted friend and colleague Ed Foreman was always there to support him in any endeavor, including the many magic spells and rituals Parsons was working on. However, it seemed that Foreman too had his limits when one of these magical spells went horribly wrong, at least for the shaken and frightened Foreman. The story, as has been described, is that after one of these rituals with Parsons late one night, Foreman claims to have felt the whole house shake. He then heard screams and a number of entities outside his window, which he claimed were banshees. He ran downstairs and asked if anyone else had felt the house shake and if they saw any of the entities, but no one did. Whether all of this was in Foreman's imagination or not is a matter for debate among those in the 14 world. But the fact is, something happened that night which would have a profound psychological effect on Foreman for the rest of his life.